Hello, and welcome to today's Safety and Health webcast, GHS Status Update, Get Compliant by 2016. The webcast is sponsored by, and features the expertise of, Brady Corporation's Client Services Group. My name is Melissa Rominski. I've been the editor of Safety and Health magazine since 2007, and I'll be moderating today's session. Thank you for joining us. The presentation will begin shortly, but first, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. Please note that the views of the speakers and their organization are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of the National Safety Council or Safety and Health magazine. Mention of any commercial enterprise, product, or publication does not mean the Council or the magazine endorsed them. At the conclusion of today's webcast, we'll have a question and answer session. To ask a question, simply type it in the text box that's located in the lower left-hand corner of your screen, then click the Submit Question button. Feel free to ask a question at any time during the presentation. It won't be visible to other attendees. We'll try to answer as many as possible, but because of the large number of participants today, not all questions may be answered. However, all unanswered questions will be forwarded to today's speakers. For basic troubleshooting information, please click the Help button located on your screen. At the end of the webcast, you'll be asked to complete an evaluation survey, and I'll talk a little more about that after the presentation. This webcast will be archived for 3 months, so you can access it after today's live presentation. Within about a day, just return to this URL to access the webcast. And with that, I think we're ready to begin. Our speakers today are Heather Marenda and Tom Smith from Brady Corporation's Client Services Group. Heather is the Client Services Engagement Manager for Brady worldwide. She establishes solutions based on comprehensive safety assessment processes. These solutions include training offerings, such as OSHA 10 or 30-hour courses, hazard communication training, lockout-tagout training, and confined space entry and awareness. Heather also works with the internal sales team and clients to better develop safety solutions and services. She has more than 18 years of field-based environmental health and safety consulting and solutions experience. Tom Smith is the Regional Product Marketing Specialist for Workplace and Identification Solutions at Brady. He has 20 years of experience developing safety, identification, and productivity solutions for commercial, industrial, and construction markets. With that, I think we're ready to get started. So I'll turn the webinar over to our first speaker, Heather Marenda. Heather?
Thanks, Melissa. Good afternoon or good morning, everyone. In 1983, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, issued its first hazard communication, or what many of us have commonly referred to HazCom as the Employee Right to Know or HazCom programs. This requires a comprehensive hazard evaluation and communication process from the employer to the employee. Chemical manufacturers and importers must develop and provide a container label as well as what we now refer to as a safety data sheet, or an SDS. Employers with workers exposed to hazardous chemicals must develop a hazard communication program including labeling information and instructions, access to safety data sheets, as well as training on workplace hazardous chemicals. The previous hazard communication standard established requirements for minimum information that must be included on labels as well as safety data sheets, or MSDSs, material safety data sheets, but did not provide specific language to convey the information or a format in which to provide it. Country by country and around the globe, hazard classification and communication laws are similar in purpose, but different enough to result in inconsistent hazard classification for similar products and dissimilar-looking labels and safety data sheets. The need to harmonize and improve safety information and facilitate international trade through compatible classification methods, safety data sheets, and labels was identified. In this slide, you can see the examples of how in the United States we typically use something that's called a right to know, either a diamond or the HMIS boxes, and color coding with a numerical rating system. The WHMIS standard in Canada is utilized today that includes pictograms and some basic text on hazards. Lastly, the HSID standard in Europe is utilized using pictograms as well as text. None of these today, or up until today, had been harmonized, and the purpose of the United States and OSHA adopting GHS is to incorporate harmonization. What exactly is the globally standardized and globally harmonized system of classification and labeling of chemicals, or GHS as we know it today? GHS gives us an opportunity to become standardized with other countries from whom we may share trade or purchase product with. You can see in this example, we've taken many elements from existing labels and we've created one standardized label that includes a required format as well as the pictograms that you can see on the acetone label off to the left. A basic history of what has gotten us here throughout the world is in 2012, the U.S. adopted and updated the GHS standard into their education program. HazCom has not gone away. We have just implemented aspects of GHS into the regulation. Canada is still reviewing and in development for adoption of GHS. Mexico has a voluntary standard, meaning it is not required to be followed, but they do endorse the utilization of GHS. Brazil has also begun some implementation from a regulatory standpoint. Today there are 27 European Union countries who have implemented the GHS pictograms as well as other regulatory items. Australia has implemented and begun implementation. They also have a 2016 deadline. Both China and Japan have implemented. Today, 67 countries globally have at least partial implementation. This is a United Nations-based regulation, and therefore many UN countries have adopted the regulation. OSHA updated its hazard communication standard. Many of us know it as 1910.1200 to align with the United Nations globally harmonized system of classification and labeling of chemicals, GHS. Modifications are intended to reduce costs and burdens while still protecting employers and employees. Many of the modifications include a revised criteria for classification of chemical hazards, which is done by the chemical manufacturer, revised and standardized labeling requirements, a specific format for safety data sheets, as well as requirements for employee training on labels and safety data sheets. General elements of the GHS or HazCom training and what I'll be covering this morning is understanding the new or the updated hazard communication standard, understanding safety data sheets, understanding labels including pictograms, signal words, hazard statements, precautionary statements, understanding the relationship of the safety data sheet and the label, and lastly, understanding health information. Again, here's an example of how we've gone from a very divergent and not standardized labeling system to a very standardized labeling format and system, one that with training we can all understand. The use of visual GHS pictograms is the new method of identifying chemical hazards. Pictograms need to be interpreted through the use of a safety data sheet and will be linked to the various risks involved with that type of chemical all through the safety data sheets. Specific hazards are broken into 3 hazard classes. These include a chemical and physical risk, a health risk, and an environmental risk. In this slide, you can see the 9 pictograms that are being utilized. In the upper left-hand corner, the health hazards are identified by as carcinogens, mutagens, reproductive toxicity hazards, respiratory sensitizers, etc. We also have the middle pictogram being flame or a flammable, pyrophoric, self-heating, something that may emit flammable gases, self-reactives, and organic peroxides. The upper right-hand corner is an exclamation mark. This is an irritant. It may be a skin or an eye irritant, a skin sensitizer, have an acute toxicity, a narcotic effect, a respiratory tract irritant, or it could be hazardous to the ozone layer. You'll see that it says non-mandatory. Please keep in mind that this specific regulation is only applicable to the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. It does not oversee any environmental impacts. The gas cylinder represents gases under pressure on the left-hand side in the middle. The middle symbol is for corrosives. These could be skin corrosion or burns, eye damage, as well as corrosive to metal. Exploding bombs could represent explosives, self-reactives, or organic peroxides, which you already saw listed in flames. There are several categories that are listed in either a health and a physical hazard, either one or possibly both. The bottom left-hand corner indicates flame over circle or oxidizers. Something to note during your trainings, flame over circle and the flame symbols tend to be very similar. It would be prudent in many cases to make sure that your employees are trained on the very different reactivities and potential hazards of each flammable or flame over circle hazards listed. The skull over crossbones is for acute toxicity. This could be fatal or toxic. And lastly, in the bottom right-hand corner, we have environmental, which is non-mandatory, again, per OSHA. That would be an Environmental Protection Agency concern if you saw that symbol. There are 6 elements that are required on a primary container GHS label. The first is the signal word. You will either see the word danger, which is used for more severe instances, or warning, which is used for less severe. The symbols or the pictograms included again convey the health, the physical, or the environmental hazard that's associated with the chemical being used. There can be a combination of anywhere from 1 to 5 symbols on a label. Number 3 is the product name or identifier that's being utilized by the chemical manufacturer. Number 4 includes hazard statements. These describe the nature of hazardous products and oftentimes the degree of the hazard. Number 5 is precautionary statements. These phrases are associated with each hazard statement that describes general prevention, response, storage, or disposal information. Lastly, number 6 is the specific manufacturer's information, which should include company name, address, and workplace number. Benefits of a GHS formatted label are that they provide an immediate visual reminder of the hazards. Past labels tend to be fairly inconsistent in their terminology and their visuals, especially their layout. There's a very standardized signal word. It will either be, again, danger or warning. Visuals and hazard statements are also in place. Pictograms reinforce the message presented in the text while enhancing communication for low literacy or multilingual employees. Cautionary statements provide useful steps to protect and prevent from chemical-related injuries. And there's an example of a GHS-style label with all 6 elements that are included. Pardon me for a moment. I'm sure many of you have questions regarding primary versus secondary labels, or what I can use within my facility after I've taken product out of a bulk storage container. As far as secondary container labels, best practice is to label your secondary containers with the same GHS format that they came to in the facility. For example, if you had a 55-gallon drum that was labeled, you would want to mimic the label from that drum to put on your internal container. Employers may choose to label workplace containers with existing program as long as it's compliant with the existing OSHA HazCom regulation and is included within your written hazard communication program, and employees are trained to that program. Currently today, NFPA 704 and their hazard grading system, as well as the Hazardous Material Information System, or HMIS for labeling, are considered acceptable for workplace containers. Safety data sheet changes include harmonization that will standardize the order of information for ease for employees, along with improved accuracy of the information presented. Previously known as a material safety data sheet, it is now referred to as a safety data sheet. The number of required sections has been increased from 9 to 16 sections. NFPA 704 and HMIS systems. Currently, there are no plans to change the existing NFPA 704 and HMIS systems and classification. These systems will still be used primarily to convey hazardous information to emergency first responders. Currently, some of the new safety data sheets do not contain the NFPA or HMIS classifications. Main requirements, the 5 main requirements that are required today for your written HazCom plan include having a written hazard communication plan, keeping a chemical inventory, having a section regarding how you will label containers as well as warn employees, safety data sheet documentation and where those are maintained, and lastly, employee training. Please keep in mind that you must have a written hazard communication plan. In many cases, your plan may include basic information on the types of chemicals that you have, where you may maintain your safety data sheets, the type of training you do, how often you provide that training, and what you do when you have additional training that may be required because you've introduced a new chemical or you've changed a specific process. In terms of the written plan, OSHA does have some basic information within their plan, and they can give you a very basic guideline if you don't have something in existence today. I would recommend that you at least follow some of those basic pieces of information if you are still in development of your written hazard communication program. The second element to consider is keeping a chemical inventory. Today you're required to annually maintain a chemical inventory that includes all of the chemicals that you're using internally within your facility and having some type of documentation as to where they're located, perhaps even including the amounts of product that you have. This is a very opportune time for you to update your program and ensure that you've captured all of your chemicals. If you're no longer using a chemical, great time to begin lab packing or throwing out, if you can, some type of disposal methods for the chemicals that you're no longer using. With your chemical labels and warnings, that is something that you will want to make sure is included in your written hazard communication program. Internally, for your secondary container labels, you can identify those chemicals however you see fit. If your existing system has NFPA and HMIS utilized and that's what your employees are trained on, you would need to continue training them on that as well as the pictograms. And then again, updating your written plan to reflect that you're now including the pictogram inclusion and training. The other things that you may want to consider are possibly elimination of NFPA and HMIS and just sticking to the pictograms and eventually converting entirely to that program so that you're not having to train on 2 or 3 different types of rating systems. The next element is the safety data sheets. The safety data sheets are now required to be in a specific format. As far as what you will need to consider for training and labeling, all documentation and information in a new safety data sheet for a label is found in sections 1 and 2. So everything you would need for a label would be included in sections 1 or 2. Something to keep in mind in section 2 where the pictograms are listed, they may or may not include the actual pictogram. They may just have the hazard listed within that safety data sheet. You'd want to make sure during your training that your employees are understanding that and that they're aware that the pictogram may not be listed, but the hazard is still identified in that section 2. Employee training, many of us conducted quite a bit of training prior to December 1st of 2012, or 2013, sorry. And what I had encouraged and I still encourage is to retrain and retrain and retrain. 15 minutes of training on an SPS and the changes is still training. 15 minutes on labeling is still training. This is a very new concept in many cases, and we've got a lot of folks who would appreciate the retraining, even if it's something very short. But being able to really identify some of the major changes. Most certainly if you're changing your internal program, you'd want to be training on those changes and really how it impacts your employees day to day. Enjoyed my time speaking this afternoon, and I'll be on to answer questions. I'd like to present Tom Smith. He's our Brady Regional Product Marketing Specialist for Workplace and Identification Solutions. Tom has 20 years experience developing safety identification and productivity solutions for commercial, industrial, and construction markets. Tom, I will turn the presentation over to you.
All right, terrific. Thank you, Heather. Thanks for joining, everyone. Good morning if you're on the West Coast. Good afternoon if you're in the Midwest or the East. My goal in my 20 minutes of this webinar is to make sure you're knowledgeable about GHS and the steps to take to help ensure compliance. So I'll try to keep my portion to about 15 minutes so that we've got enough time for questions after. Okay, so let's dig in. I'm just going to make sure you guys can see my next slide. So I'm going to hit next. Okay, so things that you should be thinking about doing now. Here's a short list of key things to do. Most are self-evident, but represent a good reminder. I'll spend more time on 4, 5, and 6 than I will on 1, 2, and 3. But number 1 is know the key OSHA deadlines. OSHA created a 3-year time-phased plan for compliance. So depending on where you live, this may not be as straightforward as you think because, there are about 25 OSHA state plan states as well as Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, and they have their own state plans. So in some cases, the timing or the deadlines for some of the interim milestones might be a little bit different. Next, create an internal plan with milestones and assigned responsibilities. You want somebody who really comes into work every day thinking about GHS. You need a concise roadmap to determine what to do when. Third is training. Fourth is generally the phase that you should be in right now, which is really looking at your chemical transition, managing your chemical inventory. As you guys probably have seen, some chemical companies have already switched to the SDS sheets, so be aware of that. 5 is labeling your secondary containers, and I know we had a couple questions come in on chat regarding that we'll address. And then 6 is really just auditing and verifying everything in your hazardous chemical inventory. Your training program, your MSDS, SDS program, and your written procedures are up to date. All right. Key deadlines, I won't spend a lot of time on this, but no, these are the federal OSHA deadlines that I'm showing on the screen. Regarding state plan states, for example, if you're in the state of Washington, your training deadline was actually the beginning of this month, June 1st, whereas the federal deadline was about 6 months ago, December 1st. The next key date, however, is June 1st, 2015, which is where all products that are shipped from chemical manufacturers have to carry the new GHS labels and SDS sheets. One question that has come into OSHA recently regarding that is, what do you do if you have chemicals on your premises from a chemical manufacturer that is no longer in business? Do you need a new SDS sheet for those? OSHA has responded that those would be considered grandfathered in and not required to have new SDS sheets or labels. The next key date is December 1st, 2015. That's the date where our distributor partners on the phone are most concerned with, because that's when their inventories have to be changed over. So everything shipping out of the distributor warehouses have to be changed over on that date. And then finally, June 1st, 2016 is the date when all items have to be in place at your facility. Your chemicals have to have the appropriate labels. Your program needs to be updated. Your SDS sheets need to be current. Okay, so step number 2, create a plan. As I said, I won't spend much time here because it's kind of fairly self-explanatory, but you should have assigned ownership for GHS, someone whose direct responsibility is the effective implementation of GHS. Usually this falls within a safety function. Make sure to update your written programs. OSHA may look for this when doing an audit. Complete the training if you haven't done so thus far. Early on, back in 2012, we had a OSHA compliance officer in our offices talking to us about GHS, and he mentioned typically when he's going around and doing an inspection, he'll talk to employees or find employees who work with chemicals and begin asking them questions about things like what the chemicals are, what some of the hazards are associated with those chemicals, where to get more information. And if he or she answers in a vague or incorrect way, he'll typically go on to the next employee and ask similar questions. If he sees a similar pattern developing of deficiency, then he'll dig into the training plan and the training records. So make sure that the training plan is up to date and that your records are current as well. Today, you should be looking at your inventory of chemicals and talking with your chemical suppliers on when they will provide the new SDS sheets. You should also be planning for the new SDS information and determining how you'll relabel your secondary containers. And lastly, it's a good practice to establish periodic audits to verify your program is compliant. Okay, so with training, let's talk briefly there. The training should have been completed, but realistically I know that it may not be the case for everyone, or it may not be as complete or comprehensive as you'd like. Keep in mind that if you have new employees handling chemicals, those employees require training as well. Many companies keep self-guided DVDs and self-study guides on hand, typically just for new employees, and to supplement your overall GHS training. Heather, through our client services group, also provides the train-the-trainer type GHS training that's comprehensive in nature as well. OSHA requires employers to present this information in a manner and language that your employees understand. If you need to communicate work instructions or other workplace information to employees in a language other than English, you also need to communicate that information in the same manner, so the GHS information in the same manner. So if your employees are speaking largely Spanish and English is not the native language, you need to provide the training materials and some of the GHS information in that language as well. If your employees' vocabulary is limited, the training must account for that. And by the same token, if you have employees that are really not literate, telling them to read training materials will not satisfy the employer's training obligation. The minimum required training topics for GHS are the label and SDS elements. Your employees should know the pictogram symbols and meanings, how an employee may use labels in the workplace. They also need to know the format of the SDS sheet, where to find that critical information, how the label is related to the SDS. While it's not specifically called out in the GHS HazCom standard, because it concerns hazardous chemicals, this is also a good time to review your spill and cleanup procedures. and ensure that you've got adequate cleanup materials like sorbents on hand. A best practice is to reinforce the training with posters and wallet cards and signs posted where chemicals are used. Look for companies that provide a myriad of training options, including in-person training as well as self-study materials, particularly materials that are offered in more than one language. Okay, so managing the chemical transition. One of the activities to be doing now is to review and update your vendor MSDS management system. Whether maintained online or in hard copies, you should make sure that you have a system in place for tracking the documentation required as you receive it, as well as archiving the old information. If you keep hard copies and binders like many do, it's recommended that you keep two sets of binders, one for the MSDSs and one for the SDSs. That way you can keep track of which chemicals have transitioned to the new SDS sheets. Employers need to provide employees with ready access to the SDS information. So many companies are using a combination of both online services as well as the printed binders and SDS information located in the manufacturing areas and the plants where the chemicals are used. And those are particularly useful in the event that you have problems with computer, internet access, power issues, or some type of power outage or emergency. You still need to access that information even if you have an emergency. One common question is, do you have to maintain the old MSDS sheets? There's nothing in the HCS 2012 or the GHS regulation that requires you to do so. However, there is another OSHA standard called Access to Medical Records Standard that requires employees to keep information about a chemical for 30 years beyond its end-use date. One way many employers satisfy the requirements of the standard is to keep and archive the old MSDSs. Okay, let's talk about labeling your secondary containers and storage tanks. A good first step when it comes to labeling is to talk to your local distributor. They have a good idea of the capability of various suppliers. Pay attention to suppliers that produce both pre-printed labels as well as do-it-yourself solutions. Why? Because they have the experience and range of options to know how to make it most cost-effective for your situation. As a general guideline, if you're a company that uses only a few chemicals, only needs a few hundred labels per year, your best bet is probably to purchase pre-printed labels. For example, a 3x5 pre-printed label is about $1 each, just as a rough guideline. So if you're saying needing 300 labels, your cost is going to be about $300 to $400 annually. Now let's say you're a higher volume plant and you need to print about 3,000 labels per year. A small desktop printer like the one you see here on the far left, that'll run about $1,300. A roll of labels, which is, I think you get about 270 labels on a roll, that's about $130. So 3,000 labels will cost you about $1,400 in labels, or somewhere around 45 cents a label. So you can see the label cost is really much lower if you print it yourself. So the total with the printer and the labels for about 3,000 labels is going to cost you about $2,700. You can see that's about 10% cheaper than buying pre-printed labels. So just be aware that there is a cost savings there, and there's a sweet spot based on volume and the mix of chemicals that you're having to label. However, when you get to the really high volume, like tens of thousands of labels, it tends to switch back. If you're trying to print that many labels, you'd need somebody full-time pretty much just managing the printing function of the label. And when you factor in things like the print speeds of desktop printers, the labor cost, it really becomes more economical to purchase pre-printed labels. So just understand that there is a sweet spot for the print-it-yourself option. If you do print the labels yourself, you can purchase one-color printers like those two on the left and get pre-printed rolls of labels with GHS diamonds, already blank diamonds on them, or you can step up to more advanced label and sign printers that can print 4 colors. Of the 2-color printers that you see on the right, the one on the left is Brady's newest. It lists for about $4,000 and has the capability to print labels anywhere from 4 inches up to 10 inches wide. It's good for GHS labels, arc flash labels, safety signs, pipe markers, equipment labels, lean 5S labels as well. So when you're looking at evaluating printing it yourself versus buying a pre-printed labels, factor those into it. The other thing that's important to make sure of is if you're looking at buying a printer, make sure the GHS interface software is easy to use. By that I mean when you type in a chemical name, you should have a menu of easy drop-down boxes to select for your hazard and precautionary statements. You don't want to have to type all of those in by hand. That would take forever. It should also be available in different languages as well, so that you can print, let's say, 2 languages, English and Spanish, on your GHS labels. OSHA does require English on the label, but if your workforce is Spanish-speaking, you want to be able to print that on the label as well. Your time is money, and the last thing you want is a fast printer with slow, cumbersome software. And because it's an investment, if you're looking at printers, compare warranties. Look for printers that have a more substantial warranty, typically longer than 1 year. And I believe the printers that you see here on the page all carry, I believe, a 5-year warranty. One question that was posed to OSHA recently is, can you leave some of the red diamonds blank? So if you buy pre-printed labels or you buy the roll of labels and you only need to use 3 out of the 4 diamonds, can you leave some of them blank? No, OSHA does not allow us to do that. Can you cover up a diamond? And that was the subject of a question that came into OSHA, and they said, yes, you can. You can completely cover up the entire diamond, including the red border, but you should try to make sure that the label doesn't look like it was defaced, because it may cause other downstream questions or confusion. You could put a blank white or black label that covers the entire diamond. That is acceptable. And one of the best practices is having that blank label say something like "see adjacent pictograms." That's completely acceptable. Okay, so what if you just have a black and white printer? Let's say you've already got a black and white printer. You want to try to maximize its use. Well, if it's a Brady printer, you've really got 2 options. One, you can buy the blank rolls of labels with the red diamonds. That may work in your existing printer as long as the software is updated. Or 2, you can purchase these pre-printed sheets of pictogram labels. The example you see here shows all 9 pictograms that Heather went through. 3 different sizes, 2 different materials. The labels are already pre-cut, so you just peel them off and stick them on. It's an economical option for customers with low-volume labeling needs. I think Heather mentioned storage tanks as well. If you have large outdoor chemical storage tanks, you need larger labels and signs. OSHA still requires the same 6 elements that Heather touched on be present on the sign. These signs can be self-sticking with adhesive backed, or they can be rigid aluminum or fiberglass or some other rigid surface. Depending on your durability needs, the fiberglass signs have a life expectancy of like 25 years or more and hold up to all types of weather. So if it's always the same chemical in the same storage tank, you may want to consider this option because, as you guys know, the real cost of the sign itself is minimal compared to the labor cost to install it or maintain it. And also because tank and vessel signs are larger, you do have the ability to put additional information on them, like the NFPA diamond or the HMIS ratings. OSHA allows that additional information to be added, provided it doesn't conflict with the hazard warnings or pictograms on GHS. Look for companies that have the expertise to create these custom tank and vessel signs for you from your SDS sheets, because all of the information is inherently there on your SDS sheet. Look for those companies not to charge you an extra cost in doing so, because for Brady, this is a free value-added service that we offer. Lastly, audit your program. Before the deadline and after your employees are trained, your MSDS, SDS management program is in place. You've begun labeling your secondary containers. You've updated your written program. Then it's time to kind of verify everything is compliant. It's good to have another independent set of eyes review everything because they may catch something that you may have overlooked. This can be internal or it can be external. The benefit of having somebody externally look at it is you usually get best practice information from what others are doing. Heather's our engagement manager and part of our client services group that provides visual workplace audits as well as train-the-trainer sessions on numerous safety topics, including GHS. Whatever method you choose, you should verify that all your key elements are in place before the 2016 deadline. Lastly, here are some questions I've compiled from looking and going on various safety forums and websites. I'll just go through them one by one. Hopefully these will prompt some additional questions you guys might have. Do I need to label small containers, things like vials and tubes that are very small, down to 5 milliliters or so? For example, can I place a reference number on the small vial or tube with a sheet containing the legend and appropriate GHS label information on the inside of the carton? The answer is no. OSHA does not allow that, but they've also weighed in on this. One of their recommendations was as a practical accommodation where the manufacturer can show that it's not feasible to use pull-out labels, fold-back labels, or tags containing the full HCS 2012 required information. The shipped small container, at a minimum, must contain the following: product identifier, appropriate pictograms, manufacturer's name and phone number, signal word, and a statement indicating the full label information for the chemical is provided on the outside of the package. The outside of the package must be clearly marked to ensure the complete label elements are visible, and it must clearly inform users that the small container must be stored in the outer container bearing the complete label. The manufacturer must ensure that any alternative labeling used does not conflict with any other standards. As such, the outside packaging must not present a hazard while the material is being stored. All right, another question came in last week. Are labels required on overpacked containers? No, they're not. The labels are really required on the immediate container. If the immediate container is also the shipping container, does it need both GHS and DOT labels? The answer there is yes, it does. As you know, DOT governs the shipping of hazardous chemicals in the U.S., and they actually harmonized with similar pictograms back in 2008. But you do need to fulfill the requirements of both the DOT label as well as GHS labels. I think we may have answered the other question. If I buy blank labels that have 3 empty diamonds but only need 2, and I leave the third blank, no, you have to completely cover it up. Can pictogram labels or stickers with adhesive backing be used? The answer is yes. Do I need to create an SDS if I have an MSDS from a company that's now out of business? I think I touched on this one earlier as well. No, because it's grandfathered in. There are a few more that just came in that I'm looking at. Do I need to label portable containers when the material is transferred from a labeled container into a portable container? The answer is yes. The only exception is where the hazard substance is used within the work shift and is under the control of the employee who performed the transfer. So if you've got a 55-gallon of, let's say, flammable fluid, and you need 5 gallons of that to take it over to use in the equipment, you do not have to label it as long as it's used within the work shift. It's under the control of the employee that tapped it into the 5-gallon container. Does the GHS standard apply to office settings? So things like tapes and other office chemicals. No. Office hazardous chemicals only, or office workers who encounter hazardous chemicals only in isolated instances are not covered by the rule. This includes things like the pens and tapes and other products which are really considered to be consumer products, and those fall under CP. All right, so those are just some of the questions that popped up within the last few weeks. Hopefully they've answered some of the questions you may have. I hope there's some additional questions out there. So I will turn it back to Brandon or Melissa to open it up for questions. And I think we've got about perhaps 15 minutes left.
Great. Thank you, Tom and Heather. We'll get to the Q&A in just a moment, but first I'd like to remind everyone about the short evaluation survey we're asking you to complete. That should be appearing on your screen right now. Please take a few moments to complete that. Your input is really important to us, and we'll use that to improve future webcasts. If you don't see the evaluation survey on your screen, you may need to turn off your pop-up blocker. As we expected, we've received lots of questions, so let's jump right in. First question is there a maximum number of pictograms that can be on a label?
Heather, you want to touch on that?
Certainly. There will be anywhere from 1 to 5 pictograms on a label. So 5 would be the max.
Okay. Next question is, occasionally there are one-time chemicals brought into our facility that someone might have needed quickly, so they run to the hardware store to get it. Is it still required to have an SDS on file for these single-use chemicals such as paint?
Yes, as long as you're using a product at your facility and or your employees are using it, they should have a safety data sheet. It can often, especially when it's a commercial product like that, can often be obtained from the chemical manufacturer on their website.
Okay. Next question is, how do I prove that I did a full chemical inventory of the plant? What will suffice for proof?
Typically an Excel spreadsheet or some type of a spreadsheet. The date, the listing, the location. I would recommend putting in the amount or the size of the container and having someone sign it.
Okay. Next question is, we were thinking about scanning all of our SDS sheets and having them on a database. Do we still have to keep at least one hard copy on hand?
Not necessarily, as long as the database is immediately accessible to all employees. What I mean by that is if there's a loss of power or there's a fire, you have some other way to obtain copies of the safety data sheets. But you can absolutely scan them in and keep them, or use some type of a company that would house all of your safety data sheets.
Okay. Someone else asks, are we going to have to change the signage on the process storage tanks within the facility? And if so, what's the timeline for that?
I'm going to assume that they are tanks that probably contain the same chemical in it for quite some time. And today perhaps you have an NFPA diamond at the top of the tank, and your existing tank sign has just basic information on it, chemical name, etc. Today that's okay. As long as you keep that current within your written hazard communication program, and that's what your employees are trained on, it is okay to keep that.
Thanks, Heather. Next question is, some commercial products, such as those bought at a hardware store, may not have an SDS available. Is it the purchaser's responsibility to go online and find one?
Yes, if they buy it commercially instead of through perhaps a distributor or some type of other vendor or supplier, yes, they would have to obtain that.
Okay. Another question is, we carry a lot of pipe in our yard. Do I need an SDS for all types of pipe?
I'm not sure. I guess that's a little bit vague.
Okay.
I'm not quite sure how to answer that. I would need more information.
Yeah,
okay.
If it's a hazardous chemical, yes. If it's just a pipe, probably not, is my guess.
Yeah, and it would also depend on the chemical, and that's not really an OSHA regulation. It's not the hazard communication regulation that we would refer to in a case like that.
Correct.
Okay. Next question is, my company has a lot of chemicals on site at all times, and it's not feasible to keep updated hard copies of all SDSs. We manage our safety data sheets electronically. I believe OSHA requires a backup system in case of technical outages. Do you have any suggestions on how to implement a backup system?
Again, even without having to print all of them, if they have some type of a laptop or a tablet, some way that they can immediately access it without power.
Okay. This is, do I need to label each one of my gas tanks, oxygen, propane, etc., and should they come from the manufacturer that way?
If it's a cylinder, it should already be labeled by the provider. If it is an above-ground storage tank, so for example, air gas, or someone is providing that tank, again, they still own that tank in many cases. You typically just allow them to place their tank on your property and you use it, and you pay for that use. They should be labeling them. The onus is on them to do that.
Okay. Someone has a question about smaller containers. They say, can we label the smaller container with a marker as long as the product is used in the same shift? If not within the same shift, how much time is allowed?
The answer to that is yes, they can do that. It is not entirely recommended. I would say that it's not best practice. They can do that as long as they utilize the entire container in one shift. OSHA defines a shift as 8 hours.
Okay. Next question is, do archived chemicals in our company's database, which we do not use, but the chemical manufacturer is still in business, do we need to switch to the SDS format for those?
No.
Okay. Sorry. Next question is, are GHS labels required on the outside of outside sheds that house chemicals?
No, GHS is simply intended for hazard communication. Anything outside of a building would be for first responders, and that's when NFPA 704 would apply.
Okay. Next question is, if we use an online company for SDS, do we need a printed inventory as well, or can we say our inventory is online?
If they can include the inventory within that program, that's sufficient.
Okay. Sorry. The question is there a difference for labels for pure chemicals from manufacturers or a mixture of materials and many consumer chemicals? I'm sorry, I don't quite understand the question myself. This one might be tough. It says, what kind of written plan should a temporary staffing company have?
Temporary staffing or temp agencies still have to have written programs and train their employees on that. The employers who utilize the temp agency also have to have that, and they must train the temps to that program.
Okay. Next question is, if a client brings an oxygen tank to work every day, do we need to label it?
Again, it should be labeled. If it's there every single day, they probably need some other internal labeling, but they wouldn't be labeling the cylinder. It would be more along the lines of gas under pressure or no smoking.
Okay.
Which is not a HazCom topic.
Thank you. Another question is, are there concerns with the confusion between NFPA 1 to 4 hazard classes and GHS 1 to 4 hazard classes?
Yes. Today, the GHS rating system is only found on or within the SDS. Today, it is not utilized on a label. But yes, it is completely opposite of NFPA or HMIS.
Okay. Someone else asks, if our vendor does not provide updated SDSs per the GHS, will my facility be faulted in an audit?
Tom, did you get any insight on that when you spoke to the OSHA compliance officer?
No, it sounds like that the onus is on the chemical manufacturer for the primary containers. And once they're shipped into a facility, they should have that new labeling and SDS information with it. So it's a little bit unclear, but my guess is it goes back to the chemical manufacturer to provide that information, because it has a lot of technical information on there that maybe the user of that chemical may not be aware of.
And I would concur as well that it's not bad practice today to notify your vendors and others who you purchase chemicals or supplies from, asking them when they would be sending the updated SDS, and that you require it by a date prior to June 1st, 2016, or that's the wrong date, sorry. But let them know that you would like to obtain that receipt, and you want to make sure you're in compliance. I don't think anybody knows at this point definitively what would happen in that case.
Okay. Someone says, does Clorox under the bathroom sink count under the GHS?
Your workplace, your employees, even a cleaning service, or even if you're not hiring the cleaning service, your employees still have the potential for exposure.
Okay. You may have answered this, but someone says, has OSHA provided any guidance on workplace labeling guidelines for small containers that don't have enough room to allow all required information? I'm referring to situations when a chemical is transferred from the primary container with a full label into the secondary container to create a solution.
Yeah, OSHA doesn't give you a lot of latitude because they have deemed that small containers, if it contains a hazardous material, warnings as a larger container contains hazardous material. The employee that's exposed to this faces the same risk as a large container, so it should carry the same labeling. The only thing that they have allowed you to do is by the labeling slightly by what can go on that small container if it's extremely small. They generally urge you to use things like tags or fold-back labels or roll-up type labels for those small containers, but if it's very extremely small, like a tissue sample or a lab vial, you can get away with a little bit less information, and that's in the OSHA standard. I briefly touched on it, but if you go that route, then you have to keep that small container in the large outer container, and that outer container has to have the full GHS label on it.
Thanks, Tom. Someone has a question about lift trucks. They say, my company has many electric-powered lift trucks. Do the batteries in those need to have labels on them? We currently have MSDS sheets for the batteries.
That's a good question. Those are most likely contained, and they can't open the acid battery. The manufacturer may supply that, but typically you do not. The battery would actually be a primary container that you're not responsible for labeling.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Heather. There's also a forum on LinkedIn for anybody that's on LinkedIn regarding GHS, and that was one of the questions that came up. But it wasn't for forklift batteries; it was for smaller batteries. And the response from OSHA was no, batteries would not fall under that regulation.
Great, thank you. Another question is, should backpack sprayers with pesticides be labeled under the secondary container labeling requirements?
Most likely, however, they're labeling them today would be compliant. Pesticides are a completely different animal in many cases.
Okay. And next question is, we are a biology laboratory that generates thousands of vials of specimens preserved in a hazardous material, formaldehyde. Do we need to label each vial, and if so, how?
Yeah, I think that goes back to the previous question that OSHA is not providing a lot of latitude, so they're going to have to be labeled in some fashion with something that either attaches to the vial, either a tag or something similar to that.
Okay. Someone else asks, when two products are mixed, do you need to have both labels?
If they're labeling them internally, yes, you essentially can take you could use one label and take the most serious hazards from both products, as well as precautionary statements, etc., and combine them.
Okay. Well, thank you, Heather and Tom. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. I'm sorry we didn't get to everyone's questions, but all of today's unanswered questions will be forwarded to our speakers. And again, I hope you take the time to fill out the evaluation survey on your screen. And that ends today's Safety and Health Magazine webcast. I'd like to thank Heather and Tom, Brady Corporation's Client Services Group, and all of you who listened in today. Have a great day.